Good afternoon. My name is Wioleta Rydlewska. I am a student of Occupational Safety and Health program at the University of Alaska Anchorage. We are on opening slide of my presentation, Knockout Workplace Violence. Slide number 2 presents learning outcomes for this course. At the end of this presentation, you will be able to define the term of workplace violence, recognize types of behaviors that constitute workplace violence, distinguish between categories of workplace violence, and list engineering and administrative controls to minimize workplace violence. Attending this course will benefit you by teaching you how to minimize the risk of workplace violence in your workplace and how to recognize concerning behavior regarding workplace violence. Slide number 3 shows some statistics regarding workplace violence, and these statistics show how big the problem of workplace violence is and how important it is to know how to minimize the risk of this hazard in your workplace. According to National Safety Council, every year approximately 2 million workers report workplace violence in the United States. According to OSHA, every year, workplace violence is the cause of 1,175,100 lost work days. And it causes the $55 million lost wages every year. Now we are on slide number 4. According to Bureau of Labor Statistics, workplace violence accounted for 10% of all fatal occupational injuries in 2016. In the same year, workplace violence caused 500 fatalities among workers and 16,819 non-fatal workplace violence incidents. Among these 500 deaths related to workplace violence, 31 involved workers of retail establishment and 23% involved workers performing protective service activities. Non-fatal workplace violence incidents involved 70% of healthcare and social assistant industry workers. Now we are on slide number 5. OSHA defines term of workplace violence as any act of threat or physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or another threatening disruptive behavior that occurs at the work site. Workplace violence ranges from threats and verbal abuse to physical assaults and even homicide. Workplace violence can affect and involve employees, clients, customers, and visitors. Slide number 6 presents behaviors that constitute workplace violence. They include stabbings, beatings, shootings, suicides, rapes, threats, even being followed, sworn, or shouted at, and any other harassment of any nature constitutes workplace violence. Let's move to slide number 7. OSHA didn't develop mandatory regulations concerning workplace violence, but developed guidelines for employers who are seeking to protect workers from workplace violence. These guidelines are voluntary and advisory in nature and informational in content. These guidelines are based on OSHA's Safety and Health Program Management Guidelines that were published in 1989. Slide number 8 lists 4 major categories for workplace violence as defined by OSHA. These categories are violence by strangers, violence by customers or clients, violence by co-workers, or violence by personal relation. Slide number 9 presents the first category of workplace violence, violence by strangers, in more detail. In this category, the perpetrator has no legitimate relationship to the business or its employees and is usually committing a crime in conjunction with violence. Examples of these are robberies, shopliftings, and trespassings. This category of workplace violence is most common in retail trade sector, for example, convenience stores and liquor stores. Let's move to slide number 10. Violence by customers or clients is the next category of workplace violence. According to NIOSH, this category is most common in healthcare settings. Example of this category of workplace violence are nurses being attacked by patients in a hospital, or taxi drivers being attacked by their own passengers. Slide number 11, and violence by co-workers category of workplace violence. This category of workplace violence may occur between supervisors and subordinates or between co-workers or peers. Examples of this category of workplace violence are bullying, physical assault upon oneself or another person, or intimidating or frightening others at the workplace. The last category of workplace violence is shown on slide number 12. This category is violence by personal relation. In this case, the perpetrator has a relationship to worker outside of work. The example of this category of workplace violence is when a spouse abuses the worker in the workplace. Slide number 13 lists occupations with higher incidence of workplace violence according to the book Security and Introduction, written by Philip Porpera. These occupations include law enforcement, mental health, retail sales, teaching, transportation, and medical industry. Slide number 14 lists workers at higher risk of workplace violence. According to J. Keller and the book OSHA Safety Training Handbook, workers at higher risk of workplace violence are those who exchange money with the public, guard valuables, deliver passengers goods or services, work out of mobile work site, which this includes, for example, taxi drivers or police cruisers. Workers who work alone or in small groups are at higher risk for workplace violence too. These who work during late night or early morning hours are also at high risk for workplace violence. And workers who work in high crime areas have a bigger possibility to be involved in an incident of workplace violence. Let's move to slide number 15. Warning signs for workplace violence are listed on this slide. It is very important to know what you need to be aware for in order to protect yourself and others from workplace violence. Look for noticeable changes to typical behavior and emotions of a person. This can be a person who is increasingly belligerent, hypersensitive, gets easily irritated or angered, can be withdrawn, is not coping. A person who has obsessive thought patterns or conversations, or a person who is unusually disorganized or disheveled. Slide number 16, hazard prevention and control. Hazard prevention and control includes identifying and evaluating control options for workplace hazards, selecting effective controls for minimizing workplace hazards, implementing these controls in the workplace, and following up to confirm that these controls are being used and maintained properly. And lastly, evaluating the effectiveness of controls and, if needed, improving them, expanding or updating these controls. Hazard prevention and control for workplace violence includes engineering controls, administrative controls. Response following the incident is also important in preventing workplace violence, and employee training. Slide number 17 lists some engineering controls that are used for minimizing risk of workplace violence. These include installing alarm systems and other security devices, installing metal detectors that can detect weapons that are brought into the workplace, video recording for areas and high risks, bright, effective lighting, both indoors and outdoors, that will increase safety of the employees by making them more visible by others. Safe rooms for use during emergencies where employees can be placed in case of emergency. Deep service counters or bullet-resistant glass, and placing curved mirrors at hallway intersections to make sure that workers can see what is going on around the corner. Slide number 18 shows administrative controls for minimizing workplace violence. Most important is zero tolerance policy toward workplace violence. It has to be clearly communicated by employer to the workers. Employers should make sure that there is minimal amount of cash in each register, so people are not tempted to steal it. Important is also the policy of when doors should be locked, during which hours. Employers should develop and implement emergency procedures in case an incident occurs. Employers should also have liaison with local police and state prosecutors, should require their workers to report assaults and threats. It's very important to report any incident of workplace violence in order to react and implement effective measures. Employers should also provide staff members with security escorts anytime they have to leave building into area at high risk for workplace violence, for example, a dark parking lot. Slide number 19 and post-incident response. According to OSHA, post-incident response should include first aid and medical treatment for injured workers, trauma crisis counseling, critical incident stress debriefing, and employee assistance program for victims. Incidents of workplace violence are very traumatizing for the victims and also people who were witnesses of such incidents. So it's very important to provide necessary help in order to help our employees recover from these incidents. Now we are on slide number 20. In summary, today we talked about workplace violence term, types of behavior that constitute workplace violence. We talked about 4 major categories of workplace violence and engineering and administrative controls for minimizing workplace violence. Let's move to the next slide. In conclusion, workplace violence accounts for 10% of fatal incidents, generates high costs for employers, is most common in certain industries and affects workers that are performing certain activities. Workplace violence can be minimized by following OSH guidelines, implementing administrative and engineering controls, as well as providing proper employee training for recognition of workplace violence behavior and for the proper response to such incidents. Slide number 22 presents all the sources I used in development of this presentation. Thank you for your attention.